Oh, hey there! I recently spoke about nostalgia and video games, and during that video I went on a bit of a tangent about Mega Man, but by doing so, I realized how strange and interesting the evolution of individual video game series can be. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at the series that I consider to be the four pillars of the NES, being Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Mega Man, and Castlevania. Yes, I know that there are a ton of series that got their start on the NES, but for this video, I just wanted to focus on the approach that these four games took. You see, what I found so interesting about these four series is that to this day, they're still going strong. Some more than others, but they've all had an enormous amount of entries into their respective series. And yet, from the very beginning, it felt as if only one of them knew exactly what it wanted to be. And that's Mega Man. Nowadays, anyone who grew up with these games or just became interested in video game history knows about the rather unique take that Mario, Zelda, and Castlevania took after their first blockbuster games. For those who are unaware though, I'll do a quick recap to bring you up to speed, starting with the most famous being Mario. For all intents and purposes, Super Mario Bros. On the NES saved video games after the video game crash of 1983. It's a rather straightforward platformer consisting of 4 stages across 8 worlds. Worlds feels like a really strong word to use because there's really no theme to any of them aside from a palette swap, but still. And yes, I know, it's probably a bit unnecessary to describe what Super Mario Bros. Is, but honestly, who knows? Maybe some people started with Mario 64 and they just never looked this far back. Taking the role of Mario, you work your way through stages, either jumping over enemies to bypass them or on them to defeat them. You can gain power-ups such as the Super Mushroom to turn into Super Mario, allowing you to break bricks from below them, while also giving you an extra hit before death, the Fire Flower giving you the ability to throw fireballs, and of course the Superstar, giving Mario temporary invincibility and the ability to defeat every enemy upon touching them. Again, it's Mario, you get the picture. 3 years later, we received Super Mario Bros. 2 in the West. Now again, I know almost all of you know the story about how different Super Mario Bros. 2 is, being a reskinned version of Japan's Doki Doki Panic, complete with some other subtle changes. Gameplay wise, it was radically different. Jumping on enemies no longer harmed them, and you could instead pick them up and toss them. You now started off in your super form and had a health bar, only reverting to small form when you were on your final tick of life. Alongside Mario and Luigi, you could now play as Princess Peach and Toad, with all 4 characters having slightly different playstyles to them. Many levels in this game were built to showcase vertical movement as opposed to the horizontal movement of its predecessor. I promise I'm going to get to a point with all of this. Regardless, this was a pretty big jump from the first game to the second, but at that time, Mario as a series hadn't been established yet. One could even argue that the jump that Mario took from Mario Brothers and Donkey Kong into Super Mario Brothers was just as big as going from Super Mario Brothers into Super Mario Brothers 2. 3 more years passed and Super Mario Bros. 3 released, with gameplay much more in line with the original title of the trilogy, with an art style that really popped on the NES. Fresh new sprites, themed worlds with numerous stages scattered about them laid out on various maps, Super Mushroom, Fire Flower, and Superstars all returned, as well as numerous other power-ups. It was with Super Mario Bros. 3 that Nintendo really seemed to come to understand what they wanted Mario to be moving forward. The Legend of Zelda had a similar story, with the first game actually being the most reminiscent of what the Zelda series would look like in the future, while the sequel game was so radically different that it essentially became a different genre. No longer was Link viewed at from a top-down perspective, but instead, the game was primarily a side-scrolling platformer. It still had the top-down perspective for the world map, but all of the core gameplay, well, it looked like this. Because of this, the art style also had to change accordingly. While Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link is still considered a black sheep in the family, a lot of the same core concepts from the original remained. Link still traversed various dungeons that each contained a piece of equipment that would act as a key to allow Link to explore the world outside the dungeons even further. Nintendo knew what kind of game they wanted to make, but it's as if they hadn't cemented the genre that Zelda should be yet. While there are many fans of the series out there who still haven't played this game or claim it's bad, it was still a critical and financial success back in the 80s. Now of course, Nintendo wasn't the only one making games in the 80s, but terms like first party and third party weren't really thrown around back then, but there were some third-party companies that really stuck out, specifically one of them being Konami with its Castlevania series. Hey, but didn't you start this video off talking about Mega Man? Yeah, I know. We're getting there. Stick with me. Castlevania is yet another action platformer where you take the role of Simon Belmont, traversing through Dracula's castle, aptly named Castlevania. The game is split up into numerous themed stages of increasing difficulty. Simon primarily uses a whip to attack, but found throughout the castle are various sub-weapons that can be acquired as well. To this day, Castlevania is still well known for its difficulty, but overall solid gameplay, and yet it too made an interesting jump with its sequel. Unlike Mario and Zelda, the art style of Castlevania didn't change much. You still play as Simon, and he still looks like Simon, but instead of being in Castlevania, you now explore the world outside of the castle. There are various towns and mansions spread across the land, connected with various screens of forest and caves. Simon's goal is to collect the pieces of Dracula, resurrect him, and defeat him again to undo the curse that was placed upon him at the end of the last game. Gameplay-wise, it's quite similar to its predecessor, and really, one could say that this was the birth of the Igavania or Metroidvania style of game, as there is a lot more exploration involved, and it lacks the linear nature of the original game. Going forward though, with Castlevania 3, it seemed as if Konami too had decided they should return to their roots and stick with what worked best the first time. In Castlevania 3, you take the role of Trevor Belmont, with gameplay that is practically identical to the original game. It's much larger with many more stages and even a couple of optional characters to play as, but for all intents and purposes, Castlevania 3 was the Mario 3 of the Castlevania series, and that it became what a lot of fans consider to be the definitive game for quite a long time. While the series did start changing with the release of Symphony of the Night nearly a decade later, it still took quite a long time for Konami to deviate from the playstyle that they had originally come up with. And then we have Capcom, specifically the Mega Man series. You see, as I mentioned earlier, this is what really sent me down the rabbit hole while I was grabbing footage for my previous video. I just found it kind of fascinating how from the very beginning, Capcom seemed to know exactly what they wanted from the series. Aside from some graphical improvements in the backgrounds of the stages, the art style stayed identical with each new iteration. And to this very day, it's rather unprecedented to see 6 entries of a single franchise on one console, and yet that's exactly what Capcom did with Mega Man. Not only did they have 6 entries, but they never once changed how Mega Man looked. Simon's sprite from Castlevania 1 and 2 were pretty similar, and even Trevor was made in the same style. But Mega Man, you could line up all 6 Mega Man sprites from each game and not know which came from which, because, well, they're all the same. Not only did they use the same sprite 6 times, but 15 years later, they went back and used them again for Mega Man 9 and 10. These weren't fun little side games like NES Remix or Super Mario Maker. These were the full-on next entries into the classic Mega Man series, and they were using the same sprite that they made 21 years earlier. To this day, we still haven't seen anything like this, where a developer decides on an art style, and then every game after that uses the exact same art style. It almost seems like an unspoken rule that game developers are always trying to innovate or improve upon how a game looks with each new sequel that comes out. The cool thing with Capcom and Mega Man is that for the most part, they've done this multiple times. The Mega Man X series does it, but to a lesser extent, with the first 3 games on the SNES all visually looking the same, and then the next 3 games on the PlayStation all looking the same to one another as well. As for 7 and 8, well, we don't talk about those. All 4 Mega Man Zero games follow this method as well, and even a good chunk of the Mega Man Battle Network games and the Mega Man Star Force series as well. Essentially, it comes down to Capcom leaning hard into the if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. I would love to see more game developers today adapt this mentality. I think to a degree, it makes a series of games feel more connected to one another when each entry into the series looks identical to the previous entry. On top of which, there's the fact that developers would just straight up be able to make games faster if they aren't having to invent a new art style every single game. Now, that isn't to say there aren't drawbacks from this, because over time, audiences can actually develop a bit of visual fatigue. I'd say for the most part, the new Super Mario Bros. Series suffered from this, with all 4 games just sort of blending together into one generic homogeneous blob. The games themselves were fun, but the issue is that the art style of them was never really that appealing to begin with. So when Nintendo recycled it over and over and over again, each game just became that much more bland. So what's the point of all this? Well, there really isn't one. I just thought it was kind of neat and something that we don't really see much with gaming anymore. But imagine the possibilities if we did. Like, if after the Minish Cap, Nintendo released 3 new Zelda games, all using the same art style, but taking place in new lands and locations. Or maybe after Mario Odyssey, Nintendo just reuses that same engine and art style and makes Mario Odyssey 2 in the same vein as the Mario Galaxy series. Or hell, maybe we'd finally get our hands on Metroid Prime